Hello, and welcome to the latest installment in our UXDX online series. I hope you're as excited as I am for the talks that we have today. But before we jump into those, I want to give a very quick introduction to UXDX and why we host these sessions. So at UXDX, our kind of motto is that the world is full of bad software. And what we mean by that is not necessarily that it doesn't work, but that the experience is not where it needs to be. And I always use the example of the banking apps. I have a new digital first bank, as well as a more traditional bank. The apps technically do the same things, but the experience of using them is worlds apart. And I know which one I'll always reach for and therefore do more business with. Now, our mission at UXDX is to help companies build an environment that can't build bad software, because I don't think it's down to the people. It's not the quality or the skill set of the people in these teams. It's the processes that they're following that kind of lead them to end up with software that might not be best fit for purpose. And I think that there's ways that we can help companies to make sure that that doesn't happen. And the primary way of doing that is to shift from projects where you're locking in a scope too early and you don't know whether customers actually want it, to product teams where you're iterating the whole time and validating and testing ideas and making sure the customers really do want what you're building. Now, that's easy to say and really hard to do. And that's where these talks come in. So we've asked people to share how they're improving their ways of working. They're not going to cover the end-to-end process, but they're going to focus in on their area and share with you some tidbits that hopefully you'll be able to implement back in your companies. And please do ask any questions that you have this evening. We'll put those questions to the speakers. They'll leave some time at the end of their talk, and hopefully you'll be able to get more insights through that as well. But that's enough about me. You're not here to listen to me talk. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this evening, which is Kushali Sandhi, who's a senior UX designer at AWS. And she'll be talking about optimizing UX in AI-based technical products. So I'd like to welcome Kushali to the stage. Over to you, Kushali.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. I am really excited for this session, and I want to thank everyone, first of all, to participate in this. And I would really love to share what I have been learning so far, working on the AI projects recently. So let me get started with my introduction. Okay. All right. So, as you probably now know, that I'm Kushali and I am a senior UX designer at Amazon. I've been working into the UX design field for over 15 years now, and I recently got an opportunity to work on AI projects, project end to end. So I thought this will be good to share my experience about how it changed the design process a little bit, because to be honest, when I was getting started on this project, I didn't find a lot of resources. I was kind of like trying to see how can I get started, right? How is the design process different when you're working on AI products? But I didn't actually get a lot of things, although I started reading some of the books, taking some online courses. So I thought it'll be really good to just kind of share my journey and what are some tips that you could use in your design process. So coming to the agenda, I'll be first talking about why we are having this session. I talked a little bit about it already, but yes, I would like to deep dive a little bit on it so you know the goal of this. I would also kind of go into the definition of AI UX design, although it's not accurate, but I think it's just how I'm seeing AI influencing the UX design. And then we'll dive into the design thinking for AI products. At the end of it, we don't want to miss out, like, how do we measure the success when we have designed something? So we'll get into that as well, and then we can take questions as well. But if there are any questions in between as well, feel free to shoot them to us. All right. So why are we doing this presentation? So as I was saying, when I was getting started on the AI project, I didn't find a lot of resources about the UX design as such. So I was kind of like hunching for the information all over the places, right? And then I wanted to do it the right way for my very first project. So I think I would really like to share my experience based on those learnings. I also realized that since the technology itself is really coming into play with full force and power, everybody is kind of now talking about the AI strengths, right? Like where we can use it, its weaknesses. But then, whenever for the decades, whenever we have seen, right, the technology comes in, it's driven by the technologies, right? And we kind of like forget the human element. Um, it is kind of like an afterthought, right? So I think it's easy, even in this scenario, that we kind of focus on the technology more, but then we kind of forget about the emotions of the people here, right? Like, how can we make the human element important here? And that's where the UX design comes in, right? Like, our role as a UX designer, keep reminding how much it is important to not forget UX design, and we have to go with the AI being in full force, fast pace, we have to just like go along with this technology. Um, and I would like to share the tips on this, going over the design process, so that you and all of us, right, we can design with confidence. So my personal opinion is that there will be an increased significance of UX design with this technology. All right, so now let's talk about the UX design, right? So as designers, we all know that at a high level, this is the diagram from Jesse James, Garrett's elements of user experience design. So at a high level, like he put in 5 elements. Although this is not like the complete picture, but still, like this is the best that which applies for any product in real life, right? So it kind of like talks about the scope, where we talk about what is the goal of the website or the product that you're working on, right? And then we start going into the actual specification, the requirements of that particular product, and then we get into the interaction design, basically trying to define what are the task flows, the customer workflows, and so on. And then we start defining the components that will help to achieve those task flows. And then the last layer is kind of like that visual design, right, where we talk about how would that finished product look like. So far our understanding for UX design has been like these 5 layers kind of like do a good job on what we have been doing, right? Now, with the introduction of AI in UX design, most often we are kind of designing in probabilistic system, right? Like there are deterministic system. We have been working in that scenario already. So I'll be talking about the probabilistic system, where the input of the product is kind of random. At the same time, the output is also like it is like something that needs to be predicted, right? So it is also, the system itself is dynamic here. So I think it really changes the way we look at UX design now. The products we had been working were kind of like doing what we tell it to do, right? Which is what the deterministic systems are kind of. There are AI products which are deterministic, they are probabilistic as well. Most often they will be probabilistic because that is where the power of AI kind of can be seen, right? So I guess with the introduction of AI UX design, I want to point out that there are multiple layers now that gets added, right? And starting from system, how the system is built, that is something we as UX designer would want to know, right? Like how the system itself is built. What I mean by that is that the data that is being used to kind of train the AI model here, we want to know the algorithm of the AI itself, how it is working, what kind of algorithm it is using, what kind of output that model is going to generate, and then the human interaction again, right? Like how is the customer going to use the product, how is the customer going to react to the product. So there are a lot of things that come into play. And in this scenario now, these 5 layers actually get added to each of these stages of the current UX design diagram that we just saw, right? So I think mostly I personally feel that they are kind of part of the business objectives. They kind of add to the functional requirements. At every stage of these layers, the interaction design, the information architecture, we have to keep looking at these additional 5 layers, which are going to guide our user experience. Um, Okay, now I want to get into the design thinking for the AI products. So we saw what that model looks like. Now I want to talk about some of the examples and the process itself that we can use to design AI products. So I'll be talking about understanding the data. So I talked about understanding the system, the data, and the model. So this is where I want to go into a little bit deeper to kind of like share what does it mean to understand the data. And then once we have an understanding of the data itself, also think about the phases that the AI feature itself can have. And the journey mapping, which we as designers we kind of already do, but then for this AI product, how is it going to be different? Doing the design itself, and then how earning trust is actually even more important with the AI coming into picture, and then evaluating the AI experience that we have designed. So I'll be talking about each of these topics now in the design thinking. All right. So understanding the data, um, how we as designers can now participate in the proof of concept, right? So when we kind of start, or any company kind of starts an AI product, they may have an engineering team who is kind of doing this hard job, right? Of training the model. They are kind of like gathering all the data first of all to train that model. So I think in this stage it's really important for us to be part of that. Although we may not be doing the training piece of it, but we just want to make sure that we understand how much of the data is being used, how is that data, what parameters have been considered. So once we have an understanding of data that is being used to train the model, then we know the system really better. We can understand the output as well, right? So I think once you have gotten an understanding of the outputs, we kind of now also understand the success rate of the output, right? What's the accuracy, how much, how often the system is actually giving us an accurate response. So I think once we have that understanding, then it'll really help us to put the AI product into different stages, right? If the data is not good enough, then the product itself is um, not so mature enough to put really with a confidence that this is a product you can give full level of autonomy. I think if the data is something that needs to be improved over the time, then the onboarding experience itself is really different. So that's why understanding data is really important here. At the same time, the performance, how much time the system really takes in kind of responding. And then again, like just trying to understand if the data isn't good, do we have enough time to kind of improvise the model before we launch, right? So if we have enough time, again, the design kind of changes. So that's why understanding the data is really important. I want to kind of talk about the examples here. In 2011, IBM came up with this concept of Watson, which was kind of like trying to help in the healthcare industry, right? So Watson was basically focused on the oncology. So the idea was that this product will really help the oncologist to give recommendations about cures for the cancer, right? So they had a really great goal in mind, and I think they saw an opportunity here. And I think it was a great effort from their end. They kind of already spent like $5 billion to gather data from different sectors into insurance, like companies who were having the imaging details. They also kind of tied up with the oncologist experts. So they did a lot of good job on gathering data from various industries, and they started to train the model. Around 2017, when they actually partnered with a cancer center in Texas, they started to realize that the product is failing, right? So now, what really went wrong in this scenario? The thing was that the data that was being used was actually was kind of biased, right? So it was a data from, let's say, a specific geography. And if let's say the data is used from New York, and then you try to apply it to population in China, then the cure really differs, right? Because the people are different. So what happened was that the recommendation that it was giving was not really relevant to the people. So the experts, the oncologist experts, started to kind of feel that it's not giving the right information. So the product really failed. So now, why am I giving this example? It's to kind of make you all like see the value of the data itself, and how can designer come into play into very beginning to kind of try to understand the outputs themselves, trying to understand how much data we have fed in. Is the data, is there a possibility of bias here? So the data itself needs to be good enough. Another example is from Microsoft. It was a Twitter bot that they had created. I think the goal here was that this will have a very positive conversation with people. But I think this product also, within 16 hours of like deployment, it kind of like failed, because the algorithm that they had used was such that the chatbot, not chatbot, but the bot, which was on Twitter, it will learn after communicating with people, right? So as you communicate with it, it's kind of like a reinforcement learning. So you kind of talk with it, it kind of learns from that data, and then it will talk to you. So I think what had happened was that because it was in social media, a lot of people started to train the bot, it started to game the bot, and then it started to learn the bad things, and this started to like post a vulnerable post, right? So I think this was another example to kind of just show you how the data is and the algorithm is important. And we as designer, when we start asking these questions, we can raise these concerns very early on the stages. Um, all right. So now let's go into the AI feature phases, which is our second topic, right? So now, once we have understood the data itself, how good that data is, then we want to break it into three phases. As such, for example, the onboarding. So if the data itself, if we know that the product is going to have a good enough data, it's going to be a very strong product, then we can give it a lot of autonomy. But then the data itself is such that we need inputs from customers to train it, then the level of autonomy is not really high. We might need to kind of give a lot of control to people when the customers are getting started, right? So what would that onboarding experience look like for this AI feature? We might need to also think about the level of intervention, how often the people will need to intervene, right? For example, if the customer are using a product to kind of review the content that the AI has generated, so then we might want to have an approval process, right, before it actually gets to the end users. So I think we have to think about the level of intervention here while the product is in use. And then once the usage has been done, if there is a reinforcement learning that we have in the product, then we might also want to consider having a way for the customers to give feedback based on which the model can again use that data to learn. So I think there are these three stages that we might need to consider when we are designing that particular AI feature itself. Based on McKinsey Global Institute's analysis on 400 use cases across 19 industries, this was an analysis that was done, and they kind of found out that more than two-thirds of the opportunities to use AI were in improving the existing flows, right? Not actually creating a complete new AI flow, but it was within the existing flows. So I think in this whole presentation, and my experience was also to improve an existing flow that we had, right? But then there were about 16% use cases which needed entirely new workflows. So I think, but in any case, the design thinking process that we are going over will apply in both these scenarios. I just wanted to call that out, that the majority of the experience as of now might focus on like improving the existing flows. Um, Now let's get into the journey mapping. So I'm sure you all might have done the journey mapping in your design process. There is nothing to read on the right side. I just put an image so that you know that the journey mapping is still important when it comes to AI. It's actually even more important because now we want to, since we are talking about improving the existing flows for most often scenarios, we want to have this journey map as a reference to kind of compare how did we improve the flow with AI being there. Did it actually improve, or are the customers spending a ton of time just like figuring out what just happened, right? So we want to really compare the before and after, and our journey map is kind of reference for that, right? um, Once we have created the journey map in our design process, we might want to kind of keep updating this journey map with the new data that we discover, right? So if the model is getting trained really well, you might have a beta. After the beta, the product is actually really good because now it got more data. So then, this journey map might even change because now the onboarding experience might not really need that many steps to just kind of train this particular product, right? You're just like having a good level of autonomy in that product. So again, the journey map kind of changes. Even the opportunities, right? At every touch point that we add in the journey map, the touch point will really help us to see how the AI can now fill this gap, right? So we might need to keep updating that as well. So I just wanted to call that out, that the journey mapping is even more important with the AI products. um okay, now going into the probabilistic system design, as I was saying, right, like the now we might be working most often with this kind of system where the inputs are random, the output is going to be something that we might not know as well. So in this dynamic system, it really makes sense to start with the data instead of Figma, right? Because now the data is the meat of everything. So we really want to understand the data. We might also kind of want to start with a spreadsheet, where we have the input to output mapping. So we just want to understand the data first. Once we have the data, we kind of start to know what are the data variances, right? What are the scenarios we might run into? Maybe there is a situation where there is no prediction, or maybe there is a situation where the prediction is not good enough, right? It's bad, or maybe the prediction is completely wrong. So I think there are various scenarios that we might want to run into. And I think we as designers would really want to now capture those data variances in our designs. I would also kind of like encourage all of us to kind of participate in the back testing. And what I mean by that is, for example, you have this example, right, which is to um, see the pricing of the house, right? So this AI, which kind of like determines the estimated price of an house, will have a lot of parameters, right? So based on, like, let's say the location, our budget, it's comparing the pricing of the nearby homes and so on. So it might have a lot of different data that it could be using. But I think what might be very helpful is that back testing, which is to kind of go into the historical data. Maybe in this scenario, we take the last time the home was sold, and now play around with this our AI product, and kind of try to see whether the using the historical data, whether its prediction in that timeline when it was last sold, is it actually matching with the pricing that it was actually sold for, right? So that is what I mean by backtesting. And now this kind of thing will really help us understand the accuracy of the model itself. So we as designer, we will just be closely working with engineering to kind of like do this, right? um, Okay, and then lastly, I want to cover the earned trust part of the product. So we want to really allow customers to do experimentation with the AI product because AI is really new. We want to allow customers to have more control, right? When we launch this, we want to also make sure that the AI is not really posing any risk in the real world scenario. For example, the IBM Watson scenario, even that had some level of risk because it was kind of like showing the cancer recommendation for the cure, but still it was in hands of the oncologist experts, right? So we might want to really think about where we are putting the AI. It shouldn't be that it just like breaks anybody's production databases or whatever you're working in, right? So we just have to think about that. We also want to participate in the pricing model here. In my project that I recently worked on, I was kind of closely working with the product managers to have this conversation, because if we just like come up with a pricing model that is like, let's say, flat, right, but then the customer is actually not knowing what the AI is going to do, how the output is going to look like, then we might want to consider scenarios where they kind of like use maybe it for like free for some time, and then kind of when they earn the trust, then they start actually using the product, right? So I think as a designer, it's really important to again participate in this kind of conversation, so that it's not impacting the customer experience. Give control to the customer, I kind of like already talked about, and then also give them flexibility to kind of turn on or off this feature as needed. We don't want to force them to use AI. We also want to get feedback from customers, how their experience was after using the product. And then I think what might help with earning trust is that since AI could take time to kind of show the results, it can take a little bit of, let's say, few months or so. It might really help to have a way to show some kind of reporting to the customers where they can see the value of AI outcomes. They can compare, okay, now the AI is actually giving me this output, it's actually better than what I was doing before. So I think that would really help the customers to see the value. um, I think the Air Canada example, this was another example of failure where the Air Canada actually used a chatbot to kind of like give a wrong information. There was a customer trying to understand if there is a discount that they can avail. The chatbot kind of told them yes, they can. And then when they went out to the customer support to actually get the refund, they denied it, right? So this was a scenario where the trust was actually broken here, right? And the Air Canada then kind of like apologized. They maybe paid back to the customer, but again, like it is really important to kind of see these scenarios upfront so that the customers don't lose trust on the product. Now, evaluating the AI experience, I think this might be really helpful. We have seen a lot of examples now. So I just kind of like want to talk about this for a bit, that it's important in this scenario to see how the product is doing before the launch. So as a designer, I would encourage to kind of like have beta launches, maybe multiple ones if needed, to see how the customers are reacting to it, how the AI is actually helping customers. Also define the telemetry from the product usage along with the qualitative feedback. So this will really help us see how the customer is reacting to it. At the same time, I would say the feedback on the data is critical in this scenario rather than just the interaction. The spreadsheet that we had created, maybe to understand the data, maybe that is something we show to the customers, right? Get feedback on that. We might also do A/B testing if with multiple versions if needed, to kind of see the positive and negative impact of the feature that we launched. And lastly, measuring the success. As I was kind of like sharing that the AI product could really take time to show the value to the customer. So in this scenario, we might need to be patient enough to see the outcomes. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so we might need to be patient enough to actually see the expected outcomes. The adoption rate, as compared to what we have been working on, we could be expecting the adoption rate, but then in case of AI, it could be really unexpected, and we might see some time because the AI itself takes time in learning and in showing accurate results, right? So it could take time to see the adoption rate as per our expectation. The customer, themselves will need time to get confidence on the product. So I would say that track the same telemetry over the time and then compare, are we doing good? So that's my tip on that. And then based on that, our designs would need to be traded as the product gets better. So I think that was mostly about measuring success. And I just want to thank you, everyone. I would like to take any questions if there are. I know we are almost at time.
Hi, thank you for that. I have actually loads of questions that I could ask, because one of the biggest challenges I find is, how do you uncover all of the different scenarios when you're dealing with a probabilistic system, and you don't know that 9 out of 10 times it's going to answer correctly, but one time it doesn't.
Yeah, true. I think that's a great question. I guess like when I was working on the product, I was kind of asking the engineers to kind of give me the real data. So I wasn't like in my mockups, I wouldn't put just lot of ipsum. I think that's like our enemy in this scenario. So I would just like first of all try, like we have couple categories already, right? So we could think of the error scenarios, the no data scenarios, the prediction going bad, right? So we already have some scenarios. So trying to get data from the engineers, the real data, and then I kind of like try to define the user experience, right? So from the engineering, if we just like put on them, they might just like come up with an outcome that we as designers might want to change it a bit. So I think I was just working very closely with the engineering team and kind of like having these categories of which I already had in mind. And then I would ask the engineering team that, hey, are there any scenarios that I am not covering in my designs? So they might just give me more categories to add. And then I would just like revise the messaging that we want to show to the customer. So I think the data was really important. Just like having those categories in mind and on the designs was really important.
Brilliant. No, it's a great example of where kind of if it was segmented, you wouldn't be able to get as good a product. So having to work closer
Yeah.
together
Uh-huh.
is the success. We're actually over time now, so I just want to thank you once again for a great talk. I hope it was exciting and interesting for everybody out there as it was for me.
Thank you.
Thanks. Up next, we have Raymon, who is the product design manager for Marqeta, and Raymon will be talking about mastering the art and science of payment design. So I'd like to welcome Raymon to the stage. Welcome.
Thank you, Rory. Hi, all. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Raymond, and it is a pleasure to be here at the UXDX community event. I'm so excited to give this talk today and share what I've learned about designing payments with all of you here in the audience. Our agenda today is pretty straightforward. I'll start with a basic intro and the basics of payments, and then go into the meat and potatoes of this talk, which is designing payment products. I'll also talk about some future ideas before we wrap up. My hope is that after this talk, you'll understand some basic key tenets when it comes to designing payments and feel empowered to do so successfully. Like I said, my name is Raymond, and I am a design leader with years of industry experience at consumer and enterprise companies such as Medium, Salesforce, and Accenture. I am currently at Marqeta, where I lead a team that builds products to enable and elevate modern money movement. And just a small disclaimer before we begin, the thoughts that I'm sharing here belong to me and myself only. I am not representing Marqeta or prior companies that I have been a part of. So let's talk about payments. Payments as they exist today look pretty different from what it was in the past. We've gone from exchanging literal goods in a barter system to physical cash, and then now to the zeros and ones of digital payments. And with each evolution, the ease and speed of payments continue to increase. So, quick question: who of you on this call has made a purchase or sent or received money digitally? Hands up, leave a comment. I can see all of you, but I would imagine that most, if not all of you, has done so. Especially this is 2024, right? Digital payments is everywhere, and digital payments look so simple on the surface. Maybe you go to a shop, you tap your card, you wait a few seconds, boom, you're done. But when you look under the hood, there's such a huge amount of complexity. This is what it might look like behind the scenes. Let's say that you're going to a coffee shop, you're using your card to pay for a cup of coffee. You tap your card against the POS terminal, which then passes the info to the merchant bank and then to the card network like MasterCard or Visa. And then the network will then validate and passes over the information to the cardholder bank, which then approves it, send it all the way back to the network, to the merchant bank, to the POS terminal, which then displays the authorized message. And then now the transaction is complete. And when you think about payments, it's really not just about buying things at a store. You can think of things like money movement more generally. For example, you want to send money to a friend to pay for your part for dinner. Maybe sending money to a family member who live abroad, or paying out vendors, or employee salaries, or getting paid as a creator, and so on. And a lot of you on this call are probably designers, and you might be curious or maybe a little bit afraid of what it means to design in this space. Uh, there's definitely some unique considerations when it comes to payments specifically, but the good news is that a lot of basic design principles still apply. So let's dive in. So when we think about transactions, they are so common that maybe we don't really think about it all that much. But if you think about the data that is contained in each transaction, it's rich. It's truly rich in information, like who are the parties involved, how much was it, when was it made, and so on. Here's an example of a purchase receipt, which displays data like store address and contact info, the transaction date and time, the detail of the merchandise itself, the transaction amount and a breakdown, payment method and authorization, and so on. But this transaction also contains data that is not shown, like cardholder address, fraud rating, merchant category code, transaction type, and so on. And my point here is that while transaction data is rich, you still have to remember that transactions exist in many different contexts. For example, buying goods from a shop would be different from sending money to a friend or making loan payments. In each of those scenarios, the user goals are a little bit different. So you should think about ways to support them accordingly. Don't show everything all at once in all scenarios. And this is also applicable if you're dealing with commercial payments. Like, for example, you're paying a vendor for software licenses or goods or whatever it might be. In this case, having information around things like approvers or department or invoice number and so on, those would be useful. And last but not least, be mindful of nuances when it comes to payments ecosystem. In the US, for example, credit cards are a pretty common way to pay, but it is also more expensive for the merchant as compared to, for example, Europe. Or in some countries, paying cash on delivery is still a common payment method as well. So think about how these differences would influence your design and product decisions. You have to keep in mind that you are always, always, always designing product and features in the context of an existing payments ecosystem and never in a vacuum. So, in a nutshell, you gotta know your users and their use cases. Think about their goals, what would be useful in those contexts, and don't forget about the payments ecosystem. As a designer, you have to be diligent about this. What data or what research is available to support your hypothesis? How would you collaborate with your stakeholders to answer these questions? And so on. In tech, you often hear the phrase move fast and break things. But this is not necessarily the best approach when you're dealing with payments because we're playing with a different set of rules. People are so sensitive about sending and receiving money, and mistakes can be costly, literally. might sound counterintuitive, but frictionless experience can be harmful in the context of payments. Preventing human error by adding a little bit of friction is easier than trying to undo transactions. So a quick story time. A couple years ago, in 2021, a Citibank employee accidentally sent the full amount of a loan, which is $900 million, instead of just the interest, which is $7.8 million. The software, as you can see here, isn't exactly clear. So the user is supposed to check multiple checkboxes here, not just one, to override the default settings. And this still went through despite the multiple layers of approval as part of the process. So the moral of the story here is that clarity is critical. You can't depend on processes alone to prevent catastrophic human errors. So for example, how would you make this workflow clearer? Maybe you add a summary screen before executing the transaction. Maybe you put in a delay or whatever it might be. And when it comes to payments, really speed is secondary. Clarity is more important. And adding friction in the product experience is actually preferable. And to build on that, clarity also means being transparent with users and building trust with them, whether it's things like fees, conversion rate, or when the money will arrive, and so on. You might be tempted to do dark patterns to hide some of these. But when you think about dark patterns, they might be beneficial to the business in the short term, but they erode trust in the product in the long term. And interestingly, there's also evidence that being transparent might actually be beneficial to the business. In the US, unbanked lower income consumers often use check cashing places to liquidate their money in spite of the high fees. You can see here the list of fees that are associated with the check amount. But the transparency here means that the consumer knows exactly what they're getting and how much they're getting in the end. Whereas at banks, fees like monthly account fee or overdraft fees and so on, those things are less visible to the consumer. And they can really wreak havoc on people's finances, especially if you live paycheck to paycheck. And we've been talking about digital payments and how speedy and convenient it is. But in addition, there's also some opportunity around access and equity. Cash, in particular, can be a little bit inaccessible to people with visual impairments, those who are blind or with really poor vision. And making them accessible would mean major changes in our current infrastructure. Now, I can speak on all currencies, but the US dollars is definitely one of those because all the bills are the same size, right? Whether you're looking at a dollar bill or $100 bills. So when you're building products or features in digital payments, accessibility should be part and parcel of your process. Making an accessibility as you're designing and building is much, much easier than trying to fix it after the fact. Now, this talk isn't focused on accessibility specifically, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that accessible products would also benefit every person, every user that use your product, not just those who have disabilities. And earlier I mentioned how transaction data is really rich in information. And with the explosion of digital payments, different products are also experimenting with the social aspects of transactions. But this can present privacy risks if you're not careful. So if you're building digital payment products or features, treat your user data with the utmost care. Another advantage to digital payments is also how easy it is to share your financial information across accounts. With a click of a button, you can connect your mortgage payment, for example, to your bank account. But it also doesn't mean that everything should be shared everywhere by default. Doing so might increase privacy and security risk, not just for you, but also for all the parties involved. So we should empower users to have control over their financial data and access. So needless to say, trust is a key tenet when it comes to payments. Strive to build products that are transparent, accessible, and respectful of user privacy. The last point about security and privacy is especially important when we consider fraud. In the US alone, there were about 2.6 million fraud reports in 2023, and this resulted in about a $10 billion loss. This is a significant amount of money, and I can only imagine the numbers being even bigger when we go outside of the US. And the unfortunate reality is that fraud is inevitable when it comes to payments. Digital channels have made it so much easier for bad actors to scam people out of their money. And then now with AI, things have become even more sophisticated. In one extreme example, scammers were using deepfake videos in a live call, mind you, not pre-recorded footage in a live call, which is wild, to trick an employee into paying out $25 million. Those AI-generated videos that you've seen on social media or whatever, those aren't just silly tricks. Bad actors are actively using those new developments and new technologies in AI for malicious purposes. But on the flip side, we're also seeing some rise in AI-powered detection and mitigation methods. So in essence, the system would first establish a baseline of what normal looks like, and then monitor the data continuously and flags deviations as it occurs. And in the long term, it also continuously adjusts its logic and parameters and as new data comes in. So there's definitely some overlap here between this point about AI and the previous talk. So yeah, in the current day and time, you kind of have to deal with AI and think about that and how that might impact your designs and products. And of course, I think some of you, if not most of you, have dealt with fraud, as the victim or being on the receiving end of fraud, which is so stressful, right? Who wants to do that? So it's also essential for you as designers and builders of products to make fraud prevention and mitigation a part of your product to mitigate those negative impacts. You'd want to alert the user in real time and automate protection to stop the bleeding first. And then you'd want to provide a shortcut to reverse if it's a false positive, but also create a pathway to recover if it is indeed a fraudulent activity. So when it comes to fraud, you have to deal with it head on. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Bad actors are always lurking in the background, and they will pounce at every opportunity that comes in. You can either be caught flat-footed or be prepared to deal with it. Another unique thing about finance is how regulated it is. You will be dealing with multiple parties in the mix, like banks and networks, MasterCard, Visa, UnionPay, and so on, who each has their own compliance requirements. And not to mention also that different types of programs have different requirements. Maybe a debit, for example, debit program would be governed and bound by different set of rules from a credit program. And these requirements could also vary. Some might be pretty high level and generic guidance, while others can be very, very, very specific, like this example of card art display from MasterCard. And of course, I'm not a lawyer, you're not a lawyer, and that's fine. You don't need to know every single thing off the top of your head, but you are still responsible for your designs and your decisions. Do your homework. Review your designs with the legal and compliance experts at your company. In a nutshell, don't mess with the law and don't assume things. So far, we've been talking about payments in a present context. But of course, payments continue to evolve and exciting developments are happening all the time. When I think about the future of payments, these come to mind. The future is fast because of real-time payments. connected thanks to open banking, and smart, made possible by programmable payments. And payments is a constantly moving field. And as designers and builders, you should at least be aware of these developments so that you can continue to build and evolve your products and services. Now, real-time payments are kind of the new quote-unquote hot thing in payments because it enables money movements to be completed in seconds, not hours or days, with older methods like ACH or wire transfers. And this has a huge impact on liquidity and also potentially financial inclusion for more. But on the other hand, there's also the increased potential for fraud due to the instant and irreversible nature of real-time payments. And speaking of the US, the adoption of real-time payments in the US has been a little bit slow compared to other geographies like India, for example, with UPI. So right now in the US, at least, coverage is a little bit patchy at best. I've touched on this a little bit earlier, but open banking has also become increasingly popular today. It's never been easier to share your data across companies with services like Plaid, for example. For consumers like you and I, it means that we are in more control of our financial data. And for companies, this could also mean lower barriers to building and offering financial products, even if it's not a core part of their offering. And this is what embedded finance is all about. But it's not without its challenges. Again, when you share data with multiple parties, they will have varying security levels, and your data will only be as secure as the weakest link. And additionally, considering that there is still a large segment of the population that is unbanked now, open banking might disproportionately benefit those that are more well-off and tech-savvy. And last but not least, programmable payments, which isn't really a new concept per se. For example, think about your Netflix subscription, right? Where you're automatically paying a certain amount at a regular interval, like monthly or annually, for access to something, to a service. But this could go way, way, way further. The conditions that is set for programmable payments can be said to be pretty sophisticated and complex, especially in commercial use cases. For example, send payment if the shipment has arrived at the East Coast warehouse and 2 supervisors have signed off of inspections. So we're kind of combining things like geo, time, role, and so on and so forth. And when you think about smart payments or programmable payments, automated execution like this would reduce the operational overheads and human errors, while at the same time increasing safety and transparency. There's also the potential for more dynamic pricing models beyond your basic usage tracking. Of course, on the flip side, it could be less flexible, especially during abnormal circumstances like a natural disaster or a pandemic, which we're all pretty familiar with. And last but not least, there might also be some privacy and ethics questions due to increased surveillance. To wrap up, I'd like to remind you of the key tenets that we discussed earlier when it comes to designing payments. First, you got to know your users and their use cases. You want to prioritize clarity over speed, continue to build and maintain trust, deal with fraud head on, and last but not least, be compliant with laws and regulations. Payments, whether you realize it or not, is so central to our lives. Everyone needs to pay and get paid, and payments is how we make it happen. And that is all. Thank you so much for your time and attention today, and I hope that the talk has been insightful for you. I've included here a QR code link where you can get a copy of the talk and give me some feedback, and would also love to connect with all of you on LinkedIn as well. Thanks again, and I think we can open up the floor to questions now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Raymond. That was really nice kind of deep dive into some of the complexities that are hidden behind the scenes in payments.
Absolutely.
I'll jump in with the first one because this is actually something that happened to me. I now have muscle memory. Like you said, you need to introduce some friction in payments because you don't want people to make mistakes. But when I'm doing my payments, I almost have a muscle memory of I have to do these 3 different taps in order to make a payment go through. And then I accidentally did a bad payment because I wasn't using it as a way to validate my payment. I just knew to do the payment, I had to hit these 3 different taps. So is there something else that can be done to try avoid that? Or I'm just the silly end user, but that muscle memory that people might build in with the friction that you introduce?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. For example, like maybe there's some sort of learning that we can do in the back end, right? If we see that, hey, you're sending a lot of money frequently, and maybe more than usual, is everything okay? So kind of like trying to detect patterns or kind of like interaction patterns, and maybe present additional friction or kind of guardrail in some cases. And also, I think in some cases, again, depending on what you're trying to do, right? If it's maybe for like a bigger amount, maybe we give you a certain warning, right? Maybe if it's a new person that you're sending money to, maybe we present an additional speed bump. So I think understanding kind of like what some of the use cases are would be helpful in terms of introducing potentially additional friction points. I think Venmo does this well. An example that I had with the pausing in terms of here, I don't know if I can zoom in or not, but it says here you cannot pay or change the same person in the same amount within 10 minutes, right? And also with Venmo, if you're sending payment to somebody new that you have never sent a payment before, it'll ask you for like additional info, like the last 4 digits of their phone numbers. And those kind of verification don't show up all the time. So it only shows up in certain cases. So I think understanding the intricacies of some of these use cases would be helpful.
Brilliant. I like, there's a good example with I can't remember which app it is, but when you want to delete something, it pops up a box and you have to type delete instead of clicking a button. So that's just an extra because then you know very clearly that you're deleting something.
Yeah, I think that might be GitHub or something, because I remember having to do that when I'm trying to like delete a repository. But yeah.
The other thing with fraud, so you were saying try to be always vigilant and always kind of thinking about fraud. How do you protect against something like an AI video chat with your boss where they're telling you to do something? How do you protect against something like that?
That's a tough one, isn't it? Yeah, I think with something like that, there's something that you can do in the product itself, right? But also something that has to do with kind of like the system overall, the organizational system, dealing with humans, right? Like, for example, hey, maybe if you're sending, this much money or like over a certain amount, you need additional approvals from, your supervisor or whatever it might be. It's not a perfect system by any means. But I think when it comes to kind of like AI powered stuff, it's tricky and it's still new, right? Like cases like that I shared, those aren't exactly happening every single day, like all the time. Those cases are super targeted, right? They know that they're targeting this specific person in this specific company, and they know who the people are, right? Who the bosses are, who the VPs are, and they're slowly kind of gathering information and data to craft those videos and those deep fakes. So unfortunately, like I don't have a good answer to that because I think it's there's multiple layers to that. There's like things in the product itself. There's things in terms of like the organizational structure and systems that you have to take into account. But yeah, it's rough. I don't think there's like a clear answer now, and also like the fact that it's changing constantly is also a challenge. Yeah.
I guess that keeps things interesting for designers going forward, trying to overcome. It's a cat and mouse game.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's always true with payments, because, like I said, fraud is such a big part of it, right? Like when you're designing products and payments, you have to think about like the worst case scenarios, right? Like how might we prevent potentially fraudulent activities? How do we deal with that? What is like the right balance? And ultimately, we're probably not going to get it to zero, but how can we minimize it as much as possible?
Brilliant. Well, that actually brings us to time. So I just want to thank you once again, Raymond, for that talk. I enjoyed it, and I hope everybody else out there did as well.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks. So that brings us to an end for today. But if you did enjoy it, please do consider joining us in Dublin for our UXDX EMEA event, which will be over 3 days, 50 speakers, 10 workshops. So it's going to be a fantastic event. But if you won't, or if you can't make it to the event, then please do consider joining us at our next UXDX Online. Just want to finish by thanking our speakers and thanking you all for attending, and look forward to seeing you next week. Goodbye.